always meant the same thing. Today, we're doing a really fascinating deep dive into this whole world of same-sex encounters. We're going from, today's big urban centers like Berlin and Paris, and then jumping way back in time, even to the battlefields of the American Civil War. It's quite a trip.
Yeah, it really is. And our mission today is basically to unpack a whole stack of sources we've gathered. We've got contemporary guides, stuff about queer nightlife in Berlin and Paris right now. But we're also looking at serious scholarly research on same-sex intimacies, historically speaking, during the Civil War era.
Right.
So the idea is to pull out the key bits of knowledge, the important insights, and kind of give you a shortcut to understanding how this thing we call cruising has evolved, the different contexts, the nuances across time and cultures.
And I suspect there'll be some surprises along the way.
Oh, definitely. Expect a few facts that might make you go, aha, and maybe challenge some assumptions you didn't even know you had.
Okay, let's get into it then. Modern cruising. Berlin. It's often called Europe's capital of kink, isn't it? This place where uninhibited freedom is, well, it seems actively celebrated, not just tolerated.
That's right. And what's really fascinating, I think, is how deep these roots go in Berlin's history.
Yeah.
You've had spaces acting as gay cruising grounds there since the late 1800s. It started out more from necessity, when homosexuality was illegal, punishable, but it evolved into something culturally acknowledged.
Wow, since the late 1800s.
Yeah, and that shift really cemented itself alongside legal changes, like decriminalization back in 1969. That really paved the way for the incredibly open scene you see there now.
Over a century of this practice, that's some serious longevity for what you might call an urban subculture. So, okay, for folks looking for these nature's discreet rendezvous, where do people go for outdoor cruising in Berlin today?
Well, the absolute classic, the iconic spot is Tiergarten Park. It's the oldest gay cruising ground dating, like I said, way back to the late 1800s. You'll find specific trails. The whole area around the Siegessäule, that's the Victory Column, is known for it. The bushes near the Lohenbruck, the Lion Bridge. Also the forest bit between Bremerweg and Neuer See. It's pretty popular year-round, but especially on those warm summer nights. It really shows how these natural spaces just endure as places for discrete meetups.
Tiergarten sounds like it has this incredibly rich, long history as a cruising ground. Are there other outdoor spots in Berlin that have kind of developed their own vibe, their own specific culture? How do they maybe differ?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Berlin's got options beyond Tiergarten where, discretion and spontaneous connections happen. Volkspark Friedrichshain, for instance, is known for its discrete pathways. People talk about spontaneous connections there, especially near the Märchenbrunnen fountain.
Yep.
Then there's Hasenheit Park. It's seen as a bit more private, maybe, than Tiergarten. It's got this huge nudist lawn, and apparently a lot of the sunbathers there are gay or bisexual men. Specific cruising areas there include something called the Flap, which is local slang for a public toilet, and the wooded bit near the kiosk. Lots of little pathways throughout the woods, as one source put it. These parks really highlight how the city uses nature as a backdrop for these private moments.
The Flap, yeah, that's a memorable term. Are there other public toilets known for cruising, maybe more sort of officially designated Klappe sites?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Beyond the parks, these Klappe are basically designated cruising toilets. Klappe Elbestrasse in Neukölln is a really well-known one. It's got this bungalow design, apparently sees dozens of men daily. There's also Bahnhofslap Südkreuz, and even a historic one, the Café Actek near U-Alt-Mariendorf station. These specific public facilities, often designed with a bit more privacy in mind, they kind of reflect this subtle acknowledgement of cruising within the city's actual infrastructure.
Right. But even with this, let's say, widespread acknowledgement, I'm guessing public indecency laws are still a thing. How does that actually play out?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. While cruising is, sort of acknowledged, the laws against public indecency absolutely still apply. Places like the Siegessäule, for example, they require quite a bit of discretion. One guide mentions it's for somewhat braver gays to avoid getting charged with causing a public nuisance.
Okay, so it's a balance.
Exactly. It shows that even in Berlin, famous for being liberal, there are legal lines. Participants are expected to practice what you might call responsible freedom.
It sounds like Berlin definitely offers a huge range of outdoor options, but yeah, requires that careful dance with public decency laws.
Okay, so moving indoors from these natural spots, what about the city's equally famous, maybe infamous, indoor havens? Berlin has a rep for some pretty wild places.
It certainly does. The indoor scene is just as vibrant, just as uninhibited, really, as the outdoors. Der Boiler, for instance, gets highlighted as Berlin's premier gay sauna.
And apparently the most visited gay bathhouse in Europe. It's huge, 3 floors, different saunas, 90-degree, 60-degree, a hammam, a central pool, and then there's this labyrinthine cruising area with private cabins, glory holes, a dark room. You pay an entrance fee, about 21 or less for students. Its sheer size and complexity really say something about Berlin's commitment to anonymous, uninhibited sexual expression. It definitely cements that capital of kink reputation.
Wow, that sounds less like a sauna and more like a whole pleasure complex. Are there any important safety considerations for venues like that, especially given the scale?
Yes, absolutely critical to mention. There was a really tragic, fatal fire back in February 2017. It was at a place called Steamworks, which used to be the Apollo Splash Club. 3 people died.
Oh, wow.
It's just a very stark reminder of how vital rigorous safety protocols are in these big, often quite maze-like venues.
Yeah, that's incredibly sobering. Okay, what about clubs, especially ones with dedicated cruising facilities? I feel like Bergen always comes up.
Right. Lab, Oratory, which is actually in the basement of Berghain, is often called the most famous and popular gay sex club in Berlin. It's known for theme nights, these big S-Dank parties. Apparently, Friday happy hour gets absolutely rammed. But the sources are clear. It's not made for vulnerable souls. And crucially, they mention very few people use condoms.
Really?
Yeah, the reasoning given is that pretty much all goers are on Pro-P. This points to a very specific, you could say high-risk, pre-IP culture. It's something visitors absolutely need to be aware of before they even think about going in.
That no condom culture in lab. Oratory. That's a pretty significant detail. How does that square with the broader idea of safety and responsibility we've been talking about in Berlin, especially for visitors who might not be on pre-P?
It creates a very unique dynamic, doesn't it? I mean, while consistent pre-AP use is highly effective against HID, it doesn't stop other STIs. And for tourists, getting pre-P quickly in Germany might be difficult. So this scene really embodies that ethos of uninhibited freedom, but it comes with a very strong expectation of individual responsibility for your own sexual health.
Right.
And beyond lab, Oratory, there are other key clubs. Ficken 3000 has this underground energy and a very large dark room. Connection Club is a classic spot known for highly crowded darkrooms. And Schwiss, that's Germany's oldest queer club, apparently the biggest queer cultural institution. It's got 3 dance floors, but it's also really involved in social and political stuff. They even host unique events like the Schlager Nacht Party.
Schlager Nacht Party, so German pop music and nudity.
Apparently so. It really shows the range.
It sounds like Berlin's scene truly caters to almost every imaginable taste. Are there venues specifically for more niche interests or fetishes?
Oh, absolutely. Beyond the, let's say, more mainstream clubs and saunas, Berlin has a ton of highly specialized fetish venues. You've got places like Triebwerk, described as embodying unapologetic sleaze. They host over 300 sex parties a year, apparently with equipment like slings, a gynecological chair, a St. Andrew's cross. Others, like New Action, focus on specific dress codes, leather, rubber, uniforms, that kind of thing. Bull offers 24-hour cruising. It has a sling area. Woof Berlin is popular with bears, has a dark room. Prince Necht also caters to a beery, more mature crowd with basement cruising. There are newer places too, like Boyberry Berlin, which replaced the iconic Tom's Bar just recently. And then unique concepts like Quellgeist. It's a non-commercial SM fetish association. Not exactly a dark room in the classic sense, but it offers connections and play options. It just shows the incredible diversity in the deep niches that the scene serves.
That is an incredibly diverse landscape. Given all that complexity, how does someone even navigate it? What about the unwritten rules? Etiquette, communication, cultural nuances.
Right. Connecting this to the bigger picture, nonverbal communication is just absolutely fundamental in Berlin's cruising scene. Eye contact, body language, they're paramount. There's talk of the nod or the sidewalk 3 seconds rule. That's where you pass someone, walk a few steps, then turn around to see if they're looking back. Other cues might be, pulling at the crotch area, sustained staring, foot tapping, lip licking, stuff like that. But the unspoken rule is always, if there's no interest shown back, you just respectfully move on.
And what about consent? Even in this atmosphere that seems to champion uninhibited freedom.
Consent is absolutely non-negotiable. That comes through really clearly. Even within Berlin's very liberal vibe, respecting boundaries is critical. That Quellgeist Association, for example, their rules explicitly state all sexual acts are only allowed with the mutual consent of all participants. It really reinforces that true freedom, responsible freedom, has to be built on mutual respect.
Okay, that's clear. And what about discretion in public spaces? You mentioned needing to avoid causing a public nuisance earlier.
Yeah, the advice is definitely to stay low-key. And in parks, to hide well. It's not just about social awkwardness. It's a legal thing to avoid those charges. It boils down to exercising your freedom responsibly, making sure your actions don't cross that line into public disruption.
Got it. And beyond the cruising specifics, are there broader German cultural traits that might influence how these interactions play out? Anything visitors should be aware of?
Well, Germans can be a bit direct, okay? Sometimes very direct. But it's usually not meant to be rude, it's just the communication style. Also, punctuality is a big deal. That idea of gay time being fashionably late apparently isn't really a thing in Berlin like it might be elsewhere.
Good to know.
And another thing, the queer community in Berlin is described as pretty political and socially conscious. So don't be surprised if conversations turn to things like gentrification, trans rights, or climate change, even in social settings. It's a scene that often mixes pleasure with a political engagement.
Interesting. So it's not just about sex. There's a real sense of community and social consciousness woven in. Okay, turning to safety and well-being, what are the absolute must-know guidelines for cruising responsibly in Berlin?
Well, personal safety really starts with trusting your gut. If a situation feels wrong, just disengage. Maintaining some anonymity is often advised, although just use a first name or a nickname. Always be aware of your surroundings, know your emergency exit, so to speak. Maybe let a trusted friend know where you're going. And just reading the room is vital, making sure the space feels right for cruising.
And sexual health, especially thinking back to that no condom culture we discussed at places like Lab.
Oratory, right?
Yeah.
Practice safe sex is the fundamental message. That means consistent use of Priap or Doxypep post-exposure or condoms. It's crucial given that specific culture in places like Lab. Oratory, anyone visiting who isn't already on Priap, is strongly advised to sort that out before they arrive in Germany. Getting it quickly once you're there can be tricky.
Okay.
And it's also worth noting, one source mentions that gonorrhea apparently is quite common in Berlin.
Yeah.
So awareness is key. Always carry lube, hand wipes, maybe even bring disinfectant for sauna cabins.
It sounds like Berlin does have a pretty robust support system for its LGBTQ plus community, though. What are some of the key health resources available there?
Oh, definitely. Berlin has an extensive network. Schullenberching Berlin offers really comprehensive counseling for gay and bi men, trans and inter people, folks living with HIV/AIDS. They offer multilingual support too. Checkpoint BLN is a dedicated queer sexual health center testing, treatment, pre-PPEP access, anonymous tests. Berliner AIDS Hilfe does general STI/HIV testing. Manometer, which is actually Germany's oldest switchboard for gay and bi men, also provides anonymous tests and counseling. Plus, there's the Zentrum for Sexual Gesundheit, which has multiple sites. The whole approach seems really integrated and supportive.
That's good to hear. Finally, for Berlin, in our, super digital age, how have apps and online communities impacted or shaped the cruising scene there?
Well, there's definitely been a huge shift towards using dating apps for arranging hookups. Grindr is still massive, the world's largest LGBTQ plus app. And it's dominant for those hookups and casual encounters because it's location-based. Though people do mention privacy concerns, bots, sometimes biphobia, Scruff often gets mentioned as fostering more of a community feel. It tends to attract a perhaps more mature crowd that's open to actual dating. It also has that venture feature for travel planning.
Right.
And then there's Romeo. It was actually founded in Berlin back in 2002. It's described as one of Europe's most enduring digital meeting grounds for LGBTQ men. Really popular in Northern Europe. They pride themselves on being independent, though some users find the interface may be slightly outdated.
Are there more specialized platforms, maybe for more local, detailed info?
Yes, definitely. Planet-Randy.com is described as a comprehensive guide specifically for gay cruising in Berlin, and it lets users share their own experiences. Gayzine.net also has extensive forums covering numerous locations where people share info and arrange meetups. These local platforms offer that more nuanced, user-generated content that you might not get on the bigger apps. They give you a more detailed kind of insider view of the scene.
Okay, so we've really explored Berlin's scene. Vibrant, uninhibited, complex. Now let's pivot. This is a really interesting comparison. Paris, often called the city of love, generally seen as welcoming to LGBTQ plus people. How does its approach to cruising compare? You mentioned there's a vital nuance here.
Yeah, looking at the bigger picture, while Paris definitely projects this broad, progressive image, there has been in recent years a noticeable increase in homophobic attacks reported. This really brings up a fundamental question, doesn't it, about the relationship between increased visibility, which is generally positive, and potential backlash. It means visitors and residents need a heightened sense of awareness. The city is welcoming, yes, but personal vigilance is still really important. It adds this layer of complexity to what seems like an open atmosphere.
Right, that's a crucial context. So Given that slightly more nuanced environment, let's look at Paris's dedicated indoor spaces first. The saunas, the bathhouses. What do they tell us about the Parisian scene?
Parisian saunas seem quite varied, definitely specialized, catering to different tastes. Sun City is mentioned as iconic, popular. It has this Indian Bollywood decor. Apparently gets super busy on Sundays. IDM is one of the largest in Paris, 5 floors, also gets packed on Sundays. Then you have spots that sound maybe more niche, like Key West, described as rather quiet, rundown, and unfriendly, which suggests a very specific appeal, perhaps.
Huh, okay.
Or Le Band's Thai, which is newer, Thai-inspired. L'Atlantide Sauna is noted for being broadly inclusive, welcoming different identities. Le Band Odessa attracts bears and mature guys. This variety suggests a scene that caters to diverse tastes, maybe within a broadly welcoming, but perhaps less overtly kinky urban culture compared to Berlin.
Okay. And what about cruise clubs and fetish venues in Paris? How do they fit into the city's specific scene?
Paris definitely has a solid range of cruise clubs and fetish venues too. L'Impact is a popular naked cruising bar, 2 levels, cabins, slings, glory holes. Very direct. For fetish folks, there's Full Metal, which is leather and denim friendly. Le Keller is a real institution, been around since 1977 apparently. Known as a hard fetish club, BDSM, fisting parties, that sort of thing.
Long running.
Yeah. Newer spots like Le Mensch offer kinky experiences, but in these unique 400-year-old cellar vaults, which sounds atmospheric. You also have specialized places like Boxman, which is both a sex shop and a cruising club. And Ex-Goys, formerly Le Bunker, is interesting because it only serves non-alcoholic drinks. The scene is clearly dynamic, with new places like Red Zone popping up late 2024.
That's quite a mix. Shows it's a thriving and adaptable scene. Was there any big change in the Paris scene recently, something that really reshaped it?
Yes, one major thing to note is the closure of Le Dépôt. Historically, it was Paris's largest sex club, some said Europe's largest cruising bar, but it hasn't reopened since the COVID crisis hit.
Oh, wow, that's significant.
It really is. It highlights how dynamic these scenes are. Even huge established venues can close, and that often leads to new, maybe more specialized clubs emerging to kind of fill that gap.
Okay, so let's move outside again. What about outdoor and public cruising spots in Paris? What do people need to know to navigate those?
Well, specific outdoor locations mentioned include the Tuileries Garden, particularly the shrubs at the East End. Certain metro stops also function as places for making that knowing eye contact. St. Paul, gateway to the Marais district, is one. République, apparently crowded line 11. Botzaris near Parc des Buttes-Chaumont, especially on weekends. And even La Défense, the business hub, often seeing men in suits cruising. These spots rely a lot on subtle cues, mutual understanding.
Right. And what about those more infamous spots like the Bois de Boulogne? What's the deal there?
Yeah, Bois de Boulogne is widely known for prostitution. Now, it's really important to understand the French law here. While prostitution itself isn't illegal, being a client is.
Oh, okay.
So if you're heading there, especially at night, you need to be aware of that distinction and definitely avoid engaging with sex workers along the roads. Bois de Vincennes is also mentioned, potentially having a gay clothing optional area that people find via online searches. So that's another type of outdoor encounter possible there.
Okay, that legal distinction is vital. What are the broader legal considerations for public cruising in Paris? Is the act of cruising itself illegal?
No, cruising itself, just loitering or seeking contact, isn't illegal. But, and this is a big but, public sexual activity is strictly forbidden. It falls under exhibitionism, Article 222-32 of the French Penal Code. This covers real or even simulated sexual acts that are imposed on the view of others. The penalties are serious. Up to 1 year in prison and a 15,000 olive fine. Sex in a public toilet is also illegal.
Okay.
So discretion is absolutely crucial to avoid legal trouble. Staying in secluded areas, well away from public roads where you might be seen, is key. The law focuses specifically on the public nature of the act, not just whether it's consensual. That's a critical difference to grasp.
That's a very clear legal line. So how do you prioritize safety when cruising in Paris, keeping in mind both these legal aspects and that concerning rise in homophobic attacks you mentioned?
Right. First off, always carry condoms and lube, basic but essential. When outdoors, dress smartly but not conspicuously, avoid expensive or new clothes as conditions might be rough. Secure your valuables, use zipped pockets, keep your phone silent, and definitely avoid checking apps openly, which can make you a target. Maintain situational awareness, know your exits, try to stay relatively near other people if possible, communicate your intentions clearly. And if you face unwanted advances, try to avoid direct confrontation, but be ready to make noise, raise your voice, or push away if necessary. It's about this layered approach to personal safety.
And cleanliness, that seems important too, especially in shared public spaces.
Yes, absolutely. Always clean up after yourself. Dispose of condoms properly in bins, never flush them down toilets. This helps avoid public complaints, which could lead authorities to crack down on cruising spots. It's a small act of responsibility, really, that helps preserve these spaces for everyone.
Makes sense. And if, unfortunately, someone does become a victim of crime, theft, assault, homophobic abuse, what should they do?
They can report it. In Paris, SOS Homophobie is a key organization. In the UK, Gallup runs a helpline and can liaise with French police, even offering anonymous reporting options. It's really important to stress, being in a cruising area or engaging in discreet, consensual activity is not illegal in itself and absolutely shouldn't stop someone from reporting an actual crime. Your safety has to be the priority.
Okay, good to know those resources exist. Let's talk about sexual health and support in Paris. What's the general guidance there?
Again, safer sex practices are paramount. Consistent condom use with plenty of water-based lube. Peer EP is highlighted as being up to 99% effective against HIV. Doxypep is also available for post-exposure prevention. While the risk of HIV from oral sex is low, other STIs are definitely possible. Proper condom disposal is essential. And crucially, you always have the right to stop any activity at any time, no questions asked.
And how would you describe France's overall stance on HIV/AIDS and healthcare for the LGBTQ+ community?
France generally has a very proactive and progressive history here. They were one of the first countries to recognize the HIV virus, and they're world leaders in research. There are no restrictions on HIV-positive individuals entering France, and the healthcare system is generally high quality and accessible.
That's reassuring. What are some of the key support organizations in Paris specifically for the community?
There's a really strong network. AC2 Paris and ARCAT are well known. ARCAT has its Point Solidarite Day Center, offering legal and medical advice. A Kiosk provides free confidential info on HIV/AIDS and STIs. The LGBT Center Paris is a major community hub. They even host something called Café Lunettes Rouges, which are specific gatherings for HIV-positive individuals to connect and support each other.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. TEG is a nonprofit focused on prevention info and distributing free condoms. And Basiliad provides direct support services, meals, housing, counseling for people living with HIV/AIDS. It shows this really holistic approach to well-being and community care in the city.
Okay. We've covered the vibrant, sometimes complex scenes in modern Berlin and Paris. Now let's take that big leap back in time, much further back, to an era where the very words we're using barely existed. What on earth was cruising like, or what was the equivalent during the American Civil War?
Right, and this is where we absolutely have to start by talking about anachronism. It's so important. The terms homosexuality, gay, they just didn't exist in the mid-19th century. People didn't have that conceptual framework to identify themselves as gay. Same-sex acts definitely happened, but they were seen as specific behaviors, not as something defining a person's whole identity, their whole being.
Okay.
So historians often use the term queer more as an analytical tool here to describe experiences and behaviors that fell outside the heterosexual norms of that period without imposing our modern labels onto the past.
That's a really fundamental distinction to make up front. So given that context, what was it about the Civil War specifically, the social landscape, the demographics that might have created conditions for same-sex encounters to happen more often?
Well, the war created these unprecedented, massive, concentrated homosocial environments. Think about it. Military camps, naval ships, prisons, hospitals. You had millions of men removed from traditional family structures, away from women, for long periods. This automatically creating conditions where same-sex relationships and encounters could just emerge more frequently, partly out of situational factors, partly out of a basic human need for intimacy, for release, when the usual avenues weren't available. The very fabric of male social life at that time became the cruising grounds, if you will, born out of circumstance, not identity.
That's fascinating. So the whole evolution of how we even think about sexuality from just acts to distinct identities, that plays a huge role here. What were attitudes like before the war, say, regarding things like sodomy laws?
Well, sodomy laws were on the books, yes. They were mostly inherited from British common law. But historical records show they were actually rarely prosecuted. There seemed to be little interest in actively enforcing them. Even the severe penalties, sometimes including death, were hardly ever carried out. There was a bit of a growing concern about gender nonconformity starting in the 1850s, with some laws against cross-dressing, but the main focus was still on specific acts, not on an inherent identity.
And when did homosexuality as an identity, the way we understand it now, actually start to emerge?
The word itself, homosexuality, was coined in German in 1869, and it only really entered English usage in the mid-1890s. It was largely through medical reports, starting around the 1870s, that it began to be framed as this inherent morbid condition. That's the shift from just describing acts to defining a type of person, often pathologically. And in many ways is what created the concept of the closet. So during the Civil War, if someone was cruising, they weren't looking for a gay partner in our sense. They were looking for someone willing, someone available for same-sex acts, often just situationally. It was about opportunity and necessity in a world that didn't have these identity categories yet.
And how did the general culture of the time, 19th century homosociality, play into this? Victorian culture, for example, we know, had these very intense, affectionate same-sex friendships.
Exactly. Victorian culture was full of strong homosocial bonds. Men formed deeply affectionate friendships, sometimes even shared beds. Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed is a famous example, often without that necessarily being seen as explicitly sexual in the way we'd assume today. This cultural fluidity, this acceptance of intense male bonding, actually made cruising, in a way, easier but less explicit. It was more opportunistic. Sexual acts might sometimes emerge from these existing emotional bonds, or just from proximity and need within these already intense male-dominated environments. The social structures themselves kind of blurred the lines that we see as much more distinct now.
Let's talk specifics then. Love among soldiers. These same-sex intimacies within the military during the Civil War. What kind of evidence do historians actually have to work with to piece this together?
Yeah, scholars like Thomas P. Lowry and Irene Monroe have done really important work here. They confirm these relationships and acts happened, drawing on vital primary sources, court-martial records, which are gold mines for this stuff, medical records, personal letters, diaries. These give us these rare, invaluable glimpses into what was mostly a hidden history.
Are there any particular cases from those records that really stand out, that illustrate the situation?
Oh, definitely. There's a documented instance from 1865 where 3 pairs of Union Navy sailors were disciplined for improper and indecent intercourse. One case is quite detailed, involving Marion Chapman and Henry Harper on the USS Panola. They were charged with scandalous conduct. Witnesses saw them huddle together like man and wife. Chapman was observed washing Harper, combing his hair, and caressing him. They got sentenced to 10 years hard labor. And the records suggest these kinds of clandestine relationships were not at all uncommon in the Navy. It highlights both how common it might have been and the severe risks if you got caught and it became a public issue.
10 years. That's incredibly harsh for what sounds like mutual affection, even if deemed improper. Were there contrasting cases? Maybe where similar bonds were viewed differently, perhaps more tolerantly?
Yes, interestingly, there were. The case of Alphonse Richter and Carl Becker offers a real contrast. Their intimate bond apparently outlasted the war. It involved things like sharing domestic chores, caring for each other when sick, this deep emotional connection, and significantly, it seems their families acknowledged and accepted this bond. This suggests there might have been a degree of social tolerance for really profound male-male intimacy, as long as it wasn't explicitly labeled or condemned as sodomy or didn't cause a public scandal. It shows this fascinating spectrum of how these relationships could be perceived.
That's a really striking contrast. What about instances of gender bending during the war? You hear stories about drummer boys or women disguising themselves as soldiers. How did that intersect with same-sex encounters?
Right. There are accounts of young drummer boys sometimes dressing in drag for camp social events, and hints that the intimacy occasionally went beyond just a public waltz. And then you have the hundreds, maybe thousands, of women who disguised themselves as men to enlist. This was remarkable. And some of them formed intimate relationships with other women soldiers. General Philip Sheridan even wrote about accidentally discovering 2 such Amazons, as he called them, whose intimacy was revealed when one was wounded.
Incredible.
This kind of gender transgression, blurring the lines, definitely created opportunities for same-sex encounters, simply by allowing individuals into spaces and roles where different kinds of relationships could form outside the usual constraints.
How do scholars today interpret this male homoeroticism from that era? Was it just about individual desires and acts, or did it have wider social meanings or functions?
Well, some scholars, like Andrew Donnelly, argue that male homoeroticism, even when not explicitly sexual, served as a kind of powerful source for effective politics. That it was sometimes used, perhaps unconsciously, to promote nationalism, a sense of brotherhood, even ideas about whiteness. You see this reflected in some of the romanticized depictions of soldierly bonds, these loving male-male pairs that appear in post-war fiction. It suggests these emotional ties between men were complex and could be interpreted or even employed within broader social and political narratives. They weren't just private matters.
Interesting. And how did the military as an institution actually try to regulate sexual behavior during the war? Did they focus much on same-sex acts compared to other things?
The military's main focus, regulation-wise, was overwhelmingly on heterosexual prostitution and the spread of venereal disease. There was this view that soldiers' sexual urges were a kind of natural instinct that couldn't really be stopped, but needed to be managed to maintain fighting strength. Remarkably, sources indicate there was only one reported case of male prostitution during the entire war. It seems same-sex encounters generally flew under the radar unless they became overtly scandalous or disruptive. They probably weren't seen as the same kind of public health or disciplinary threat that widespread venereal disease was.
So, mostly ignored unless it caused problem. Okay, moving beyond the battlefield then. What about same-sex interactions among civilians during the Civil War? How did the war's massive disruption impact civilian life and maybe create different kinds of opportunities?
Well, the war drastically changed gender roles on the home front, obviously. Women took on traditionally male responsibilities, which fostered independence and self-confidence for many, although most were pushed back into traditional roles after 1865. But that phenomenon of women disguising themselves as men wasn't just limited to the military. For some, it was a way to access a different kind of life, potentially including same-sex relationships within male-dominated civilian spaces too, before or after the war. It was a kind of cruising for a whole different existence. And thinking about other confined spaces, prisons and hospitals have historically always been sites where same-sex interaction occurs, simply due to the segregation and close quarters. Even before the Civil War, records show numerous men were having sex with each other in prisons, though attitudes hardened later. Post-war, you see a much harsher punitive approach emerging, like reports of men being beaten routinely and unmercifully for sodomy in southern prisons in the early 20th century. And Walt Whitman, famously volunteering as a nurse during the war, he observed and wrote about, even participated in, these intense, passionate same-sex friendships he saw in the hospitals. These environments of shared vulnerability, suffering, and intense proximity clearly fostered deep emotional and sometimes physical connections.
And what about urban cruising in the sense we know it today? Did Civil War era cities have anything remotely like the dedicated areas or neighborhoods we see in modern Berlin or Paris?
Not really, no. Those modern neighborhoods are largely a post-World War II phenomena. During the Civil War, cities themselves were experiencing massive disruption, population shifts, resource strains, martial law in some cases. This really inhibited the development of stable, visible, queer social spaces. Urban encounters back then were likely much more discreet, highly individualized, and opportunistic. They weren't tied to finding a specific gay identity or community because those things didn't really exist in the same way. It was more about chance encounters in a much less structured, less visible environment.
Wow. What an incredible journey through time and vastly different cultures. From Berlin's really vibrant, almost defiantly uninhibited scene and Paris's more nuanced sense of freedom, all the way back to the Civil War era, where the very idea of being gay didn't even exist as we know it. We've seen just how dramatically the whole landscape of same-sex encounters has shifted over time.
It really has. And I think this deep dive into cruising across these different contexts, it reveals more than just the shifts in how sexuality is understood or expressed. It also points to something more enduring, doesn't it? This fundamental human drive for connection, for intimacy, for expression. It really highlights how societal norms, laws, technology, even huge historical events like wars, profoundly shape these fundamental aspects of human experience. They're constantly evolving, yet maybe there's a core human truth that persists underneath it all.
So, thinking about all that, what does this mean for you listening now? Maybe consider this provocative thought to take away. In a world where labels are always evolving, where social spaces shift and change, what does this whole century-spanning exploration of cruising really tell us about that core human need for connection, for intimacy, for finding ways to express ourselves, regardless of the words we use or the era we happen to live in? Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.